believed there was more to the attack than we were allowed to know.
Why the secrecy? If we were taken by surprise, if this truly was a surprise terrorist attack on our country, why the secrecy?
They believe 9/11 was an inside job.
The people at the World Trade Center and the Pentagon were murdered by forces within our own government.
Now science takes on the conspiracy theories.
The reality is, this far out, no one has been able to provide a single piece of evidence that those buildings were explosively demolished. And the reason is, they weren't.
Nobody will ever look at 9/11 the same way again.
10:06 a.m. United Airlines 93 is shot down.
We demand the story. It completes something in us. And conspiracy theories are realities. They are a narrative that improves upon reality itself.
"9/11: Science and Conspiracy."
In a hangar in New York City, pieces of a tragedy lie in storage. Closed to the public, these items were recovered from the location of the former World Trade Center, a site now known as Ground Zero. These are tangible artifacts. Their existence confirms that what once was is no longer. But the sequence of events that brought these artifacts into the hangar remains controversial.
The one thing we can say most definitely about the towers is that they did not come down because they were hit by planes and then developed really hot fires.
2,000 miles from Ground Zero, the ghosts of 9/11 haunt another location. On engineers conduct experiments that test the forensics of conspiracy, with results that only fuel the controversy.
So I think you have to keep reminding the listener that you're not necessarily telling the truth, you're telling what the official story is.
But it goes without saying, doesn't it, that any argue against conspiracy theories are part of the conspiracy.
Truthers argue that no member of the conspiracy would dare talk.
The whole idea that somebody who participated in an operation like this would willingly go on the news and I took part of it is ludicrous.
You should not be here. No, you've got it all. Bring the fallen heroes from 9/11.
Since its release in 2005, millions of Americans have viewed copies of Loose Change, a documentary that challenges the official narrative of 9/11.
Was September 11th a surprise attack on America by 19 Islamic terrorists? Or something else entirely?
There are a lot of crazy people out there, and there are a lot of crazy people in this movement. There's people that believe planes never hit the World Trade Center. There's people that think that no Jews showed up on... People that think all these outlandish things. So yes, it would be very easy to simply roll over and accept the official story and say, 19 Arabs hated us, the bad man put the plane in the building, end of story. But I mean, there's just so much more.
Truthers are a group of people who believe that the attacks on 9/11 were, if not committed by a group of conspirators in the United States, there was at least a group within the White House and the Bush administration who allowed the attacks to happen intentionally. They believe it's either one of two things. Either it's what they call LIHAP, which is let it happen on purpose, or MIHAP, which is purpose.
Why are these claims being made? Is there any evidence that supports them? And why do so many people believe them?
The official story is so insanely implausible.
None of us professionals have ever seen a high-rise building collapse.
Once you look at these facts and see how insane they are. They're moronic, actually.
But none of them have collapsed completely, as we saw on 9/11.
All I know is the American public does not know the truth about 9/11, and that is the truth about 9/11.
To understand the context of conspiracy, we need to look back into recent American history. On December 7th, 1941, the United States was attacked here at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. On November 22nd, 1963, President John Kennedy was shot here in Dallas, Texas. And in New York City, the torn earth inside Ground Zero symbolizes another American trauma. These three catastrophes hang over their respective ground zeros and share more than traumatic impact. All three spawned conspiracy theories. One preeminent historian estimates that after the Pearl Harbor attack, 50% of Americans believed Franklin Roosevelt knew of the raid in advance, allowing it to happen in order to bring the United States into the Second World War. A 2003 Gallup poll showed that 75% of Americans believe that Lee Harvey Oswald did not act alone on November 22, 1963. And in a news poll conducted in 2006, more than 33% of Americans believed the government either carried out the 9/11 attacks or made no effort to stop them.
I believe that 9/11 is the culmination of a number of opportunities for a number of very powerful people. There were people that wanted to cash in on real estate. There were people that wanted to cash in on legislation being passed. There were people that wanted to cash in on the military-industrial complex and the stimulation of it that would happen immediately after 9/11.
Conspiracy sells because it gives everybody out there a chance to understand what's behind it, what's going on. Not just the facts that the TVs and the newspapers are feeding us, but this big cobble behind it's controlling the scenes, controlling what's actually going on. It's a lot more fun. Adults like kids, they love to be scared. Conspiracies provide that safe scare. Aha, I'm actually smarter than the government. I know they're lying to me. I've got it all figured out because it really is a conspiracy, trust me.
Now, many of the steps that we recommend will help prevent such a disaster from ever happening again.
The government timeline of events has been consistent. Traveling at 440 miles per hour and carrying about 10,000 gallons of jet fuel, Flight 11's nose impacts the 96th floor. The profile of the plane leaves a gash extending from the 93rd to the 99th floor. The Pentagon attack kills all 64 people on the plane and 125 people in the building. The FAA continues to track a fourth plane over Ohio, United Flight 93. Five minutes later, at 10:03 a.m., Flight 93 crashes into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. After 3 investigations, the U.S. government concludes 19 hijackers commandeered 4 planes in a terrorist attack that took the lives of 3,000 Americans. Some believe this official version of events is not only inconsistent with reality, it is an impossibility. But we can conduct 4 experiments that can forensically simulate the 9/11 attacks. Experiments that challenge these conspiracy theories.
The reality is, this far out, no one has been able to provide a single piece of evidence that those buildings were explosively demolished. And the reason is they weren't.
By presenting this new evidence to the truthers, they and we might learn more about their theories, their beliefs, and perhaps most importantly, why they want to believe.
You take out some of those experiments you paid a lot of money for, but don't prove anything, you're going to have a lot of time to fill there that you can use.
Many conspiracy theories exist covering every aspect of 9/11. Many ask questions that seem to have no answer. Many point out apparent discrepancies in the official story. Some are based on erroneous data. Others on data that cannot be explained. Of these many theories, 4 persist. One of the central tenets of the official investigation is that the collapse of the Twin Towers was caused by fire, initially fueled by the 19,000 gallons of jet fuel contained in the 2 airliners. The fires burned inside the Twin Towers and softened key columns, causing structural failure that led to the building's collapse. Truthers dispute this official explanation of how it happened.
There was a lot of jet fuel, and it caused a big fire. Those fires went out very rapidly.
They found no evidence that any of the steel columns had even gotten up to the temperature where they would begin to lose strength.
While the jet fuel may have burned out quickly, video evidence suggests the building fires it generated burned until the towers collapsed.
If the government was 100% forthcoming and wanted to squelch any doubt as to what happened, why have they controlled the evidence so strongly?
Some truthers claim that official explanations serve unknown ulterior motives.
Who was ultimately responsible for a lot of the things that we still don't have answers for? Answers to the questions that have been ignored, obfuscated, blacked out with magic marker, documents that are still held under national security and an ongoing investigation, even though we apparently already know who did it.
There is physical evidence remaining of the interior of the Twin Towers. Sequestered in a remote corner of JFK Airport is Hangar 17. Home to this remaining 1% of the World Trade Center steel. After their collapse, the debris was removed from Ground Zero. Much of it was sold for scrap metal or disposed of in dump sites. But some key artifacts were culled and stored for future display. These artifacts suggest the immensity of the collapse.
It's very difficult to knock down something that's this massive. There's 1 million tons here that had to start accelerating and moving towards the ground. And what happened in this case is you had a whole floor where the fires were. That was 1 acre, and that steel was being softened by the heat of the fire. And as those beams bent and buckled in the heat, the whole floor started to collapse. And it may have collapsed just a little bit on one side and a little bit on the other. It may have taken a couple of seconds. But once it got some of its momentum, you had another 15 or 20 floors above it. Well, 15 or 20 floors is several 100,000 tons. Now you have a pile driver just pushing all the other floors down.
Purdue University worked with the American Society of Civil Engineers to create a science-based simulation to show the impact from the inside out. Purdue to model the to show how the American Airlines 767 penetrated the North Tower. They began by modeling the World Trade Center complex, 7 buildings on a 16-acre plaza in Lower Manhattan. This would be a living model of the North Tower inside out. Purdue used original construction blueprints, photographs, and construction data to create a wire-frame World Trade Center structure. Every column, girder, and beam had to be in the correct place. They also created a scaled 767 jetliner, an aircraft with a weight of 141 tons, including 10,000 gallons of fuel. To model what this fuel load would do upon, Purdue launched fluid-filled aluminum cans to simulate an airplane wing impacting a steel column. A thermal camera captured the impact and fluid behavior. This raw data was also added into the sequence. Thousands of man-hours and 21 days of computer rendering were needed to show a total of 1 second of actual time. It took 2 years to complete the project. This is the final Purdue science-based simulation. The jetliner crashes into the 96th floor, severing a number of perimeter columns in the structure.
And you see, I can tell you quite honestly that we didn't fudge. The broken columns in the facade, by calculation, coincide almost exactly with those that were broken, so that our model was correct.
The simulation shows the impact from many different angles. Entry. Internal destruction of supporting columns. Disintegration of the jetliner. Atomizing of the 10,000 gallons of fuel. The fires that attacked the steel network that supported the building.
You see, we're going to have a source of heat here that covers almost the entire core. And that starts heating the columns, which are unprotected. There is now no insulation on them. And it starts heating the beams. See, the beams, in a manner of speaking, provide restraint at the edges of the columns, which are loaded axially in the vertical direction. So it takes fuel and oxygen coming in, of course, to add the fire. The temperature here could have reached beyond 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. And that doesn't melt the steel, it softens it. And that softening makes the restraints on the columns not as effective. And the column itself becomes soft. So it bends to one side. And of course, there is a vertical load on it. That takes care of it. So it goes away, and that's what happened in that building.
Purdue's findings confirmed the report by the National Institute of Standards and Technology that widespread fires initiated by the jet fuel weakened the steel columns and brought down the towers.
Before 9/11 and since that one day, there have been 0 examples of high-rise steel frame buildings that have come down due to fires.
And truthers dismiss Purdue's forensic simulation as the result of inaccurate or falsified data manipulation.
It was like a controlled demolition, the distinctive kind of controlled demolition called implosion that makes the building come straight down. So you've got a massive amount of evidence that points towards implosion.
To address this controversy, we will conduct physical experiments to illuminate what really happened in the 9/11 attacks. 2,000 miles away from Hangar 17 in the New Mexico desert, the major destructive events of 9/11 did not occur as the world watched. Those events took place deep within the World Trade Center as the structures collapsed from the inside out.
What happened to the World Trade Center was you had thousands of gallons of fuel all over the floor. The entire floor was burning all at once. And that meant that the steel everywhere was being weakened, whereas in a normal fire, you only weaken one little area at a time.
Despite official explanations, truthers Gage and Griffin still believe this fire alone could not have brought the buildings down.
First of all, no steel frame high-rise building has ever come down in a total collapse because of any external damage or fire, even fire lasting 12, 15 or more hours.
Jet fuel is basically kerosene, which is a hydrocarbon. It doesn't burn any hotter than desks or chairs in the building. So it's not some massive fuel that can melt steel.
With engineering expertise and a remote desert location, we can test what burning jet fuel can do to steel. Emertech, the Energetic Materials Research and Testing Center, designs explosions to meet the criteria of this test.
At Emertech, we do tests and research in all kinds of energetic materials. So anything's explosive, pyrotechnic. If you light it off and it gives lots of heat and lots of noise, then we pretty much test it out here.
To show whether heat can really affect steel, an experiment will pit a 1-ton I-beam against 700 gallons of jet fuel.
So what we are trying to show is that if we took a weighted beam in a fuel flame and held it until it comes up to the temperature which weakens the steel, it will actually fail that beam.
In this test, a steel I-beam like those in the Twin Towers will be subjected to the heat from a jet fuel fire, the same flammable liquid spilled from the crashed airliners. Will the fire burn hot enough to deform the steel within the same window of time as the original structural failure?
Then we'll just go get the beam, and it's 20 foot, so we'll just center it up on here.
On one of the testing pads, workers construct a fire pit, which will contain a reservoir of jet fuel. Though the World Trade Center had fireproofing on the beams, the National Institute of Standards and Technology reports that material had been knocked off at the moment of impact. And where the insulation was dislodged, the temperature of the steel rose rapidly. So in our test, a bare beam is used.
We're not doing an actual full-scale beam because to load a full-scale beam would take an immense load. And so we've scaled it back. We just have a small I-beam. It's W8 by 18, which makes it 8 inches high, 18 pounds per foot. And we're loading it with about 3,000 pounds.
Unless you want to tack them on, lift them and cut them off, tack them on.
These weights ensure that the beam was scaled to match the design load of the steel. This beam is then placed over the fire pit. The 700 gallons of jet fuel is now pumped into the pit.
Grounding? Yeah.
The fuel truck must be grounded. Any stray spark could ignite the jet fuel.
Ball valve open and then just control it with that one.
The temperature of the fire is a critical factor. Therefore, a thermocoupler is set in place to monitor temperature.
Basically, this is a liquid fuel. It's got to vaporize before it can burn. So we just got to get warm enough to start vaporizing and burn it.
An electric match detonates the fuel 500 yards away from any personnel.
And we put it in an empty box as a flotation device, so it'll float on.
The jet fuel is calculated to burn for 30 minutes.
2, 1.
Will the metal maintain its structural integrity? Within 2 minutes, the thermocoupler temperature peaked just above 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Complete structural failure took. The steel twisted in the heat and the weights fell off.
Obviously, in this environment where you're getting 18 to 2,000 degrees, the steel is not going to withstand its strength for more than about 5 minutes.
This experiment concludes that exposed steel heated by jet fuel will commence to lose its strength far below its 2,600 degree Fahrenheit melting point. Within minutes, an unstable structure is created. In the World Trade Center, this heat would have been more steel. And this combined heat and the weight of the structure would have caused deformation across entire floors.
Of course, the World Trade Center managed to stand for more than 5 minutes after the impact. So they weren't seeing quite these kinds of temperatures. But still, this is showing that if you heat up steel, it is going to lose strength and it will fail.
But evidence, no matter how conclusive, is still subject to debate. To fully understand the dynamics of an alleged 9/11 conspiracy, one must also observe how truthers process information that challenges their beliefs.
Managed to stand for more than 5
We shared the results of this test with 2 truthers conversant with these fire issues.
It is going to lose strength and it will fail.
Okay, yeah, let's stop here. I think I know where this guy's going. He's going to test an isolated piece of steel. If so, that's a straw man argument.
This test does not refute or even address the overwhelming evidence for explosive controlled demolition.
David Ray Griffin, theologian and author of 8 books that posit the government's involvement in the 9/11 attacks. And Richard Gage, a practicing architect for 20 years, has designed numerous fireproofed steel-framed buildings. Gage believes the entire experiment is irrelevant, and it ignores his own conclusion that the collapse was due to controlled demolition.
This is the reason I say that it's irrelevant, because they have experiments like this that show that steel weakens in fires. It's easier and more profound for me to say it's irrelevant. You can turn the steel into a noodle. We still have the evidence for explosive controlled demolition, which they do not refute.
David Griffin also believes the experiment is irrelevant, but for different reasons.
This shows that under ideal artificial conditions, you can get jet fuel to burn at 2,000 degrees. So to have something analogous to this little experiment with this little tiny piece of uninterconnected steel, you're going to have a very long fire lasting 18 to 2,000 degrees to get anything like that. So I would say this experiment shows absolutely nothing of relevance to the issue.
After the experiment, both sides still maintain their own conclusions. But both truthers and the 9/11 Commission would agree on one fact: the buildings clearly did collapse. They disagree on the cause. If the collapse wasn't caused by the fire from the jet fuel, truthers believe it had to have been the result of a controlled demolition. But it is possible to address this issue of demolition in a very direct way. By demolishing a building and forensically examining the result. Was so sudden it sparked allegations of controlled demolition. And that makes it a central tenet of many conspiracy theories.
What we're looking at is the massive, overwhelming evidence for explosive controlled demolition of the structure.
NIST concludes that they found no evidence suggesting that the World Trade Center towers were brought down by controlled demolition. Where would people get an idea like that?
But before any debate about these demolition claims, the perpetrators must have loaded both towers with thousands of explosives without being detected. Would that even be possible? This is a key component of any demolition theory. There is only one way to really understand how a demolition works, and that is to watch one as it unfolds. On a college campus, we followed step by step the complex process of explosive prep and loading destined to claim a 9-story steel-frame dormitory.
Before the blast team can do their job, which is actually attach explosives to the building, there's a general demolition contractor who prepares the building for the blaster to do his job.
Neighbors Demolition moves on to the site and knocks out the brick facade on the bottom 2 floors, creating a soft ground floor.
The first thing they did here was they cut away the walls and exposed the columns. A blaster or explosives cannot do anything without columns being exposed. You need to have access to them.
In the Twin Towers, the demolition team would have needed access to 47 inner core columns without being detected.
Actually, they had all the access that they needed. All they had to do was get into the elevator shaft, and they would have access to the core columns and beams throughout the building. They might need a cover story, such as an elevator modernization, which it turns out was going on prior to 9/11.
The tower elevators were renovated in 2000. Even with this theoretical access, how could this large demolition team have worked in secret? The time it takes to plant these charges varies from structure to structure.
We did a lot of prep work for World Trade Center. You see what it takes for a little 8-story building. We've been in here for the last couple of weeks. I mean, the columns on the World Trade Center is 10 times bigger than what we're cutting out here.
It is such a disruptive process. You're tearing down walls. You're exposing beams, and then you're preparing those beams. You can't just do that in a day. You can't do that overnight. You can't do that with a stealth team of ninjas. You can't do it.
Wouldn't need a whole lot more than 3 weeks. It'd probably take us 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, maybe even do something like that. You'd have to have at least 100 guys or so or more to get in there and get something like that ready.
The truthers feel they don't need to provide an answer for how the explosives were planted.
This is a very different kind of operation. A real investigation would provide some of these answers if we had subpoena power, which the 9/11 Commission did not have.
With the building ready, the demolition team prepares the various explosives on site. To cut steel beams, demolition teams use a shape charge.
This actually is a piece of copper that is part of a shape charge weapon. And what happens is you put a little explosive in each one of these little pockets, and you set off the charge, and this whole rim implodes, and you get a stream of liquid copper, and this jet of copper will cut through steel.
No matter what the exact shape of the charge, they all will react the same, cutting steel when detonated. Now, personnel clear, and the demolition team places copper-shaped charges on all 24 support columns.
Now, this is a linear shaped charge, and it's wired in with the dynamite. When it cuts, it'll cut this column right on this angle, and then this piece will be deflected and displaced in that direction. You have to do the math, but it's 400 grains to a foot, 7,000 grains to make a pound. So it's not really that much, but it's potent stuff. I mean, it'll just blow the snot out of that concrete.
After double-checking their explosives, the demolition team touches off the fuse. Buried in this pile of debris should be hard evidence pointing to implosion. Evidence that should have been found in the rubble of the World Trade Center. The search begins.
Here's a piece right here, that blew away. Here's a whole rat's nest that's still tied into the building. You can't remove all of this stuff.
Richard Gage disagrees with Blanchard's conclusion.
It's a different kind of detonation. They would not leave detonator cords and devices as they do in traditional, more economical detonations. This is a very different kind of operation.
There's a lot of circumstantial claims, a lot of innuendo, a lot of whack-a-mole, which you explain one thing away and they mention something else, and it never ends. But the reality is, this far out, no one has been able to provide a single piece of evidence that those buildings were explosively demolished.
The truthers believe there may be an ulterior reason for the demolition experts' skepticism.
The firms that do controlled demolition of high-rises work for the most wealthy people in our federal government. They cannot possibly support the controlled demolition theory and maintain their clientele.
Projecting the manpower and time needed to place explosives in the 110-story towers exposes a major defect in the controlled demolition theory. The elevator upgrade referred to by truthers might have provided access to the core columns, but a large demolition team would still have needed to work in secret to break through the gypsum board walls and to cut through each column with an acetylene torch. The lack of any demolition evidence in the debris pile at Ground Zero also undermines this theory. But truthers believe the evidence, or lack of evidence, from our experiment points to the real source of the demolition.
Brent Blanchard also talks about that there's no detonator cord down in the debris piles. Well, we're talking about a very high-tech nanothermite, and its detonation mechanism is not even known by Brent Blanchard, much less us. The technology that was used to bring down the World Trade Center high-rises was very sophisticated. High-tech nanothermite is beyond the technology used by those performing classic controlled demolitions in that industry. They don't know about it. They told us they don't know much about it.
Again, our tests don't change the conclusions made by either side.
Molten metal exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit was discovered in the rubble of Ground Zero, underneath the Twin Towers and Building 7. Even with heavy rain on September 14th and 21st, a constant stream of fire retardants and water, described as creating a giant lake. These fires would not be extinguished until December 13th, 2001, making it the longest burning structural fire in history.
If thermite was the key to the conspiracy, then we need to observe how thermite burns and destroys as well. And in the New Mexico desert, that demonstration is about to begin. There are many questions surrounding 9/11 that have provoked conspiracy theories. The sudden collapse of the Twin Towers has perhaps been the most controversial. Although a search of the remaining beams and columns from the Twin Towers have found no evidence of an explosive reaction, some truthers are adamant that the towers were brought down by a controlled demolition, and these explosions were observed by eyewitnesses.
One eyewitness was standing among a crowd of people on Church Street, 2.5 blocks from the South Tower, when he saw a number of brief light sources being emitted from inside the building between floors 10 and 15. He saw about 6 of these flashes, accompanied by a crackling sound before the tower collapsed.
Professional demolition teams use a shape charge made from a C4 explosive to cut steel and send buildings crashing into their own footprint.
So this is a commercial product, so basically you just apply it. Wherever you put it at, it's going to start firing. It's going to fire molten metal directly into the column and go right through it like it wasn't there.
An explosion sends a stream of molten copper cutting through the steel. But the real evidence of any demolition job is in the aftermath. Columns in the World Trade Center debris did not have the distinctive cut of a shape charge with its permanent copper residue.
I don't see any pictures where I see columns that have been cut like this. I see columns that are broken, I see columns that are cut with a torch. I don't see anything like this in any of the pictures I've seen.
Charred detonators and other telltale signs were also absent in the World Trade Center cleanup. But truthers believe dust residue New Yorkers sampled from across Lower Manhattan after the attacks point to the real instigator of the collapse.
What I found last year was in the dust these chips that were red on one side and gray on the other side. And I had access to scanning electron microscope, and sure enough, there was in the red side iron and oxygen, implying an iron oxide, and aluminum, the ingredients for thermite. Then we look in the literature and compare, and sure enough, the fellows at Livermore National Lab, I'm not saying they're implicated here by any means, but they describe a material that has all these elements. It's a very high-tech form of thermite called superthermite.
Thermite may not be a household term, but every year countless American children play with it in its common form, the sparkler. A compound of aluminum and iron oxide. Once ignited, it burns at 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt steel. Although truthers blame thermite for these sparks flowing from the South Tower, Thomas Eager says there are other, more logical explanations.
It's possible that you could get a shower of sparks from a thermite reaction because molten aluminum reacting with something is essentially a thermite reaction. But you can't tell whether that aluminum came from a melting of the airplanes in the fire or a controlled demolition.
Was thermite the main cause of the building collapse? Once again, there is a way to find out. Emertech calculated a controlled experiment to see if thermite was a viable option in the collapse of the towers.
Today, we're going to be going through a column that's only 8 inches by 6 inches by about ½ inch thick. So compared to the World Trade Center columns, it's really puny, and we're still using over 100 pounds of thermite to try to burn through it. To get thermite to burn into metal, you have to hold it in place and let the heat transfer into the metal. So to put it on column, you have to build something that will hold this basically molten metal against the column long enough for it to do some good.
The demolition team designs a 4-sided flange and welds it onto the column. Since thermite is not explosive, it must be held in tight contact with the column until it heats up enough to melt the steel. Clay is added to the flange and the welds to protect them from the heat and focus the melting action on the column.
You want to talk to him when we get back? The thermite is not going to explode. It's not going to cause a boom. What you're going to see is basically a fire. It's going to be a much slower process.
The team scaled their experiment to see if the steel column, somewhat smaller than those in the World Trade Center, could be sheared with 175 pounds of commercial-grade thermite. If thermite melts through this steel column, the theory of a thermite-controlled demolition may have some validity. While the truthers insist that more explosive super thermite could have been used in the tower demolitions, testing conventional thermite can illuminate this physical process and answer a simple question. Can thermite of any type burn through steel beams?
Lining it with clay wasn't a total success. You can see where the clay broke off. But it looks like most of the material just basically boiled out, and we did not get that heating action that we wanted on the column.
Despite 175 pounds of thermite packed around the steel column, it remained undamaged. Our results seem clear. If thermite can't melt this small column, it wouldn't have had a chance to melt through the much larger columns in the Twin Towers. Not surprisingly, the truthers questioned these results.
And we did not get that heating action that we wanted on the column.
This guy is going back and forth between super thermite and thermite. He's talking just ordinary macro thermite. I mean, he pointed out he couldn't get the other stuff. Stephen can't get it either. So all you can do is read the literature. The military has all of this. They don't share it.
Super thermite in the sol gel form can be painted on. It's not until it dries and hardens that it becomes explosive.
While Stephen Jones envisions an easy thermite application, Emertech asserts that even if this military substance could be found, it still would not have been practical to use.
If you take just a thin layer of thermite, it'd be tough to light to begin with, but even if you did, it's just going to flash, and there's hardly any energy there.
So is the argument then, oh, well, even though you find super thermite looking residue, it doesn't make sense, so we just won't do an investigation. We'll just kind of ignore the residues that you found that blow up today because we can't figure out how they could do it, and therefore we don't have to look.
Once again, physical evidence that seems conclusive to one side is rejected by the other. Nowhere is this dichotomy more pronounced than in the events that took place at the other ground zero of September 11th, the Pentagon.
Those that think a 757 did not hit are fueled by the damage to the building and lack of large structural debris outside. particularly the lack of damage from the wings and vertical stabilizer, and the fact that those objects, as well as the engines, were never fully recovered.
Rejecting pictures that show airliner debris, truthers believe that something else struck the Pentagon, either a plane loaded with explosives or some other flying warhead. Once again, a theory needs to be put to a forensic test. There were two simultaneous attacks on American soil on September 11, 2001. The attack on the Pentagon has also been questioned by the 9/11 Truth Movement. One theory distills many of their arguments. This is the official story. About 30 minutes after takeoff, the plane is hijacked and is turned towards Washington. Flying just over the highway, the jetliner heads for the Pentagon's western facade. "189 people are killed." Purdue University analyzed this sequence of events and created a visual simulation of the attack.
We had the plans for the Pentagon, all the details, right down to the last reinforcing bar. The speed of the airplane and the direction from which came was given to us by the Transport Safety Institute, which presumably came from the black box that they found afterwards.
Purdue broke down the event into its basic components. Flight 77's path, its trajectory, the fuselage breaking up, and aftermath.
And what you're seeing here is that as the plane enters, the columns cut in the front, which is pretty fragile. It's really nothing but a cylinder. And when the column comes, it cuts into it. The Pentagon building itself killed no one. There was a collapse about 25 minutes later, after the firemen came there and started filling the building full of water.
An FBI diagram shows where the bodies of the airplane's 64 victims were found.
And that too shows the progress of the airplane into the building. The pilots, their corpses are in front, and the people who were sitting in the back of the airplane, you find their bodies further in, so that the debris was floating in, sort of like really a lava flow through the building, depositing itself as it went along. I have no doubts about the fact that the structure was hit by an airplane.
If the nose caused this hole, where's the rest of the debris from the plane? So what could blow a 16-foot hole in the outer ring of the Pentagon, smash through 9 feet of steel-reinforced concrete, and leave another 16-foot hole? A cruise missile.
At first they said that their cameras didn't capture it. They're like, none of our cameras captured the event. We have no footage. You're never going to see what happened.
The truthers consider the supposed lack of video evidence a smoking gun.
From the eyewitnesses that I've spoke to, stretching as far back as a mile away from the Pentagon, they all saw a large plane headed for the building. With that being said, what may have actually struck the building, I can't prove.
David Ray Griffin denies that there was any trace of any airplane at the Pentagon site.
What we are confident of is what didn't happen. The damage to the Pentagon was not caused by Flight 77 crashing into it. First of all, there was no physical evidence at the scene of any kind of airliner.
Patrick Smith is an author and commercial pilot who writes for the online publication Salon.
I think the wreckage that you see at the Pentagon is perfectly consistent with an airplane going several hundred miles an hour into a reinforced masonry building. You know, that's not a normal airline crash where you tend to have large chunks of the plane still intact.
David Ray Griffin has a different opinion.
You had people outside the building, you had people inside the building. They all reported no big pieces of an airplane.
The government tells me it was Flight 77, but I haven't seen any serial numbers. I haven't seen any wreckage positively identified from Flight 77, and I don't think that Hani Hanjour could have pulled off the maneuver attributed to him.
You know, he was basically just up there flailing around. I think the maneuvers, for lack of a better term, that he was performing, you know, proved him to be the crappy pilot that he, by all accounts, was.
Some truthers insist that the damage to the Pentagon, gaping holes without a telltale wing or tail imprint, could only have been made by a missile or bomb. Is it possible that a commercial airliner could account for this hole and this catastrophic damage inside the Pentagon? We asked Emertech to develop a two-part test to examine this issue. First, they will launch a projectile into a simulated structure. That damage pattern will then be compared to the actual Pentagon pictures. Second, they will plant a bomb in this same structure, and after the explosion, again compare that debris field to the same Pentagon pictures.
We're going to look at the difference between a projectile striking a structure versus an explosive event in the structure. So I'm trying to see that a plane striking a building is different than a missile striking a building.
This 1,000-foot steel rail is built for speed.
What we're trying to do is get the projectile moving at 500 miles an hour, about the same speed as the aircraft.
The sled track will launch a projectile propelled by a 5-inch rocket motor.
This orange tube is actually an approximation of the airplane because of the fact that it's just a thin wall, aluminum cylinder, which in effect is all an airplane is. This just doesn't have the wings, the tail. We want to just leave it as the cylinder shape so we know where it goes and impacts our target.
Purdue asserts it was the impacting body of the jetliner that did the damage. The wings were of little consequence because the Pentagon was so heavily reinforced. Workers position a 4-ton steel backstop to prevent the 500-mile-per-hour sled from impacting the Pentagon target.
We are not recreating the Pentagon. We just have some common building materials as our target. So I'm not claiming that this is a simulation of the actual event. I'm just trying to show the difference between a projectile striking and an explosive event.
10 spaced cement boards make up a scaled-down target mirroring the 5 rings of the Pentagon. The projectile is strapped onto the sled. Once the optimal speed is obtained, blades slice the webbing to release the projectile.
You'll see that we'll hit and impact both knife blades at the same time. There's one on this side and one on this side.
Workers prepare the target and move it into place.
Rocket motors are always considered dangerous because they're a low voltage initiated item, and they're also radiation hazard. They also have a lot of fire and heat. They can detonate if they're mishandled.
The demolition team is secured inside a blast-free zone, and the countdown begins. The first test is a failure. A miscalculation in weight sends the projectile at an oblique angle, punching through the target at roof level. Whatever hit the Pentagon hit directly, so this off-center angle invalidates any comparison. Emertech must now rebuild from scratch and prepare another test. But even if this second test is successful, truthers may not be convinced. Richard Gage finds the Pentagon aftermath pictures too confusing to use in any evaluation.
So whether an explosion made that hole or some flying device made that hole, I don't think you can make a relevant conclusion based on looking at the hole.
Are you tightening it?
Yeah, I'm just going to make sure that these are actually TV7.
Now, our second sled is ready to fire.
Sunday, we're on.
Truthers claim American Airlines Flight 77 did not hit the Pentagon on the morning of September 11, 2001.
Opinions differ at this point. People that believe a 757 hit the Pentagon, and people that don't. Those that believe a 757 did hit are fueled by the damage path, wreckage outside the building, and eyewitness testimony.
Truthers believe that an explosion or missile caused the damage at the Pentagon.
We shouldn't need another wake-up call.
The official story declares that a jetliner with 64 passengers slammed into the reinforced limestone building. To shed light on this discrepancy, Emertech designed a rocket sled experiment to test the difference between a projectile impact and an explosive event. But due to a miscalculation in their projectile scaling, the impact on the structure was inconclusive. No comparison could be made to the Pentagon aftermath.
Even though it wasn't flying perfect, it still made a penetration of 3 walls.
If it didn't pitch in your eye, you would see it. Actually, it would have had a nice impact.
The team prepares a second projectile and a new rocket sled to carry out their original experiment.
So we've added some more grout to this tube just so it'll carry through the structure, and we're just getting ready to go.
Again, the team is sequestered for the countdown and launch. The motor ignites. The projectile travels 1,000 feet in 5 seconds. At 970 feet, sharpened steel cuts the restraints. The projectile launches into free flight. It makes a direct hit into the target. This time, the experiment is a success.
And we can see damage is projecting from the front to the back, and it's about the size of our projectile all the way through.
The results of this test show what the impact looks like. The structure is basically intact with a penetration hole the approximate size of the projectile. This photo shows the exterior wall of the Pentagon just moments after the impact. The facade is damaged and the holes created essentially match the dimensions of a 757 jetliner. David Ray Griffin sees this evidence differently.
Let's assume it is a fact that something went through this outer reinforced facade and went clear through the C-ring. Well, that was so ridiculous because the nose of a 757 is so fragile. It wouldn't have made it through the outer facade. You know, I mean, it's just ridiculous.
To test the official explanation and address the truthers' beliefs that this damage pattern was caused by an explosive device, Emertech conducted a second experiment to demonstrate the very apparent differences between impact and explosive detonation.
And now we're going to put a small explosive charge and see how the damage is different.
To simulate a warhead going off, we're going to put a EBW detonator into a 1-pound Pentalite booster charge, and we're going to position it in an attitude in there to simulate a warhead on the nose of the missile, like the rocket that we just sent through here. We'll have to tape it on there though. Here. All right, at this point we're ready to clear the range and prime in and shoot it.
Okay, so here's the remains of our structure. We just hung 1 pound charge right about here, and you can see that it blew the structure away from the point of explosion. So it blew the floor down, blew the walls out, blew those walls back, and that's what an explosive does. It drives everything away from the explosive charge. So this is a completely different kind of damage than we saw from the projectile, which just went right through it.
Though Emertech demonstrations indicate a penetration rather than an explosion, this does little to end the debate. David Ray Griffin doesn't agree with this photo comparison.
And then some photos emerged that showed it is a gash. It's about 90 feet long. Now, it's very uneven, and it even looks like the stuff is coming out rather than going in. So some people argue this shows there were explosions pushing the metal outward. So it's no clear proof for anything one way or the other.
Gage and Griffin returned to our first experiment with the rocket sled and simulated jetliner.
Right.
They asked to speak with Emertech's Robert Abernathy.
It seemed like you were scaling down this the size of the aluminum to a very, very thin wall, and yet you kept the speed at 500 miles an hour. That doesn't seem like a fair scaling. Had you thought about that?
There was different ways it could be scaled down, and the way I was doing it was to scale the material down and keep the velocity the same.
Yeah, I saw that. David Ray Griffin has a question too.
The experiment you did, is it relevant anymore?
Well, does it not explain the hole in the outer wall of the Pentagon?
Oh, the outer hole, in the facade?
Yes.
Well, possibly. I mean, it's one theory, yeah.
What's the other theory?
Well, you know, there have been lots of theories, and I don't think we probably need to go into that now.
Maybe not.
Yeah. I mean, I realize this is awkward. You spent a lot of money on that, and we're telling you this is worthless.
Clearly, the truthers are reluctant to accept the results of our Pentagon tests or any of the official explanations. The truthers are determined to believe that the official story is wrong. The experiments, the arguments, the government investigations, it makes no difference. But if the official story is wrong, what story is right? Who was behind this catastrophe? How is this complicated attack pulled off? While our truthers find fault with the official account, they are reluctant to provide their own operational theory.
We are not conspiracy theorists. We're looking at the science-based, rational facts found at the crime scene and otherwise available to us. We make recommendations for a new investigation. It's up to the American people to demand a real investigation with subpoena power that may reveal who may have done it, how they did it, what are all the surrounding circumstances. We don't speculate about those matters. It's beyond our purview.
All these questions, why did they do this? Why did they do that? Those could be answered easily enough. You put people under oath, you threaten them with prison, you offer the underlings amnesty if they tell the truth, immunity.
How do you find out who did it and how in detail they planted these charges? Well, that requires a formal criminal investigation. We need the other side. We need the subpoena power of a committee to ask people.
But if the official story is wrong, something else must have happened on September 11th, 2001. Though many truthers shy away from positing their own theories, one very elaborate explanation for the events of 9/11 has been proposed. And by dissecting this theory, we can illuminate insights into both the conspiracy and the truthers who believe it.
Sundays.
Truthers are certain in their beliefs that the official story of the 9/11 attacks is wrong. And when confronted by any evidence that questions their beliefs, that evidence is rejected.
This is an inside job that the people at the World Trade Center and the people at the Pentagon were murdered by forces within our own government. That's clearly what most of us in the 9/11 Truth Movement believe.
David Aronovich has recently written a book that examines the world of conspiracy theories and truthers. He is skeptical of both.
As long as conspiracy theorists are confined to raising what they call disturbing questions about the official theory, they're on safe ground. But as soon as they get into the business of saying what their theories are, clearly what we think happened, then they have to begin to meet some evidential tests too. And it's at this point that conspiracy theories inevitably falter.
Our experiments have shown both the difficulty of placing charges in the World Trade Center and that a cruise missile hitting the Pentagon is an unlikely scenario. However, there is another theory that proposes a different plan of attack that can account for both the precision and destructive impacts measured in our 4 tests. In this scenario, 4 commercial passenger jets take off as scheduled. Here is a timeline of this theory. "8:30 a.m. in the alternate theory. A rogue plane painted to look like the real thing assumes the flight path of American Airlines 11, which is diverted to a secret airfield controlled by the military in Pennsylvania. "8:46 a.m. Another rogue plane swaps with the real American Airlines 77. At this same time, rogue American Airlines 11 hits the North Tower of the World Trade Center. 8:53 a.m., rogue United 175 takes on the flight path of United Airlines 175. Meanwhile, American Airlines 11 lands at the secret airfield. 9:02 a.m., rogue United Airlines 175 strikes the South Tower of the World Trade Center. As the real United Airlines 175 lands. "9:37 a.m. Rogue American Airlines 77 passes over the Pentagon, and a fighter jet or cruise missile under remote control crashes into the west side. "10:06 a.m. United Airlines 93 is shot down, eliminating all innocent witnesses. This timeline accounts for many things. But like the other conspiracy theories, it has at least one major flaw. It would require a very large number of people to succeed.
For 9/11 to have been a conspiracy, we would be talking about several thousand people having to be involved. We'd be talking about people in the military, we'd be talking about people in the police, we'd be talking about people in the New York City government, people in the national government, people for the airlines, we'd be talking about relatives of some of those who were supposed to have phoned, officials at national, city and statewide, those who were responsible subsequently for intimidating other witnesses out of talking. We'd be talking about the demolition teams who were sent into the towers. We'd be talking about the people who let them into the towers in the first place, who saw them go in and decided not to give witness afterwards. Thousands and thousands of people.
So obviously the U.S. government has a long history of being involved in all kinds of shenanigans and dishonest things, but this is so far beyond the pale. This would be a conspiracy that would have to involve thousands, if not tens of thousands of people, and it involved the slaughter of 5,000 or 6,000 people, and there were just so many moving parts, and that's just not the way the conspiracies work in real life. It's too massive and too messy, and it just involves too many people for them to pull off successfully.
Award-winning author David Baldacci has made conspiracy his business. His recent best-selling series involves conspiracies at the highest levels of government. He believes his fictional stories are more plausible than these conspiracy theories.
I could build a conspiracy theory out of pretty much anything, you know. It's just the not knowing that bothers people, the not knowing absolutely. JFK was probably the most classic example of that. People don't want to believe it was one guy. And they don't want to believe it was one guy because they don't want to believe that in some ways one guy was able to do that, because that means that we were just inept.
Even in a fictional context, Baldacci believes that the more participants, the less likely a secret can be preserved.
I've read a lot of the conspiracy theories about 9/11 on the internet and news, all different venues. And for me, all of them are too complicated. Conspiracies are only as strong as its weakest link. If you only have one thing that goes wrong in that chain, your co-conspirator rats you out, the whole conspiracy collapses. So not even bothering with who was behind it or what the motivation was. What are the ground forces you would need, the elements you would need to take on a 9/11 sort of situation? You need to make it simple, not complicated.
The amount of money that would have had to have been involved in planning this conspiracy, it just boggles the mind. I mean, you think about all the different people who would have had to have been on the payroll, the hijackers themselves, the people in the Air Force who allowed it to happen, the people in the press who turned a blind eye to all this, the White House officials who covered it up, the FBI people who conducted the phony investigation, the 9/11 Commission report people who conducted their phony investigation, all the members of Congress, people like me at Rolling Stone magazine who refused to investigate in order to further their careers or whatever it was. It's preposterous.
But if the logic behind a vast 9/11 conspiracy unravels under forensic scrutiny, why do so many truthers embrace it?
One of the things that I think motivates us to want conspiracy theories is that we have a huge desire for what we might call narrative, for stories. Look at the structure of the stories that we prefer. Look at the structures of fairy stories. They are made in a very kind of particular way. And conspiracy theories are fairy story realities. They are a narrative that improves upon reality itself.
You would have burned up all the fuel that was present. So you wouldn't have everything.
It is clear that people who want to believe will believe. But why?
Stop. We don't refute every detail. We refute most details.
The answer may lie as much in the past as it does in the present.
Nobody wants to feel like they were just beaten by just one person, random guy who picked up a gun and had, you know, a vague idea of what he was going to do. He went up into the book depository building, opened the window, and blew away the President of the United States with a lucky shot. Nobody wants to believe that. It's human mentality to want to build complex scenarios to answer simple questions. And I think that was JFK, Marilyn Monroe, 9/11, you know, the list can go on and on.
Sunday, we're on location at George Washington.
Deborah Merrick.
Raymond Joseph Metz III.
Millions of people around the world believe the truth behind 9/11 has not been told.
We have been and continue to be lied to about the events of September 11th, and that elements within the United States government and mainstream media continue to cover up the truth.
I think that is one of the reasons why an actual investigation hasn't been brought forward, because it would still be an investigative body within the jurisdiction of the United States government. There would still be a way for the investigation to be compromised. And I feel that our country, our government, and our mindset as a whole would not be where it is today without 9/11. And I don't think it's by accident, I think it's by design.
Recent history provides parallels to the 9/11 truth movement. There are 3 locations in America that mark a recent national trauma and the birthplace of a conspiracy. Pearl Harbor, Dealey Plaza, and Ground Zero. There might be a map into the dark heart of these common grounds. Author David Aaronovitch has examined from an historical perspective the rise and the rare fall of conspiracy theories.
There's a really interesting comparison being made between the 9/11 conspiracy theory and that which was widely believed by the American right about Pearl Harbor. They believed, because they were defeated in their desire for America not to go to war by the very fact of Pearl Harbor, and they rationalized it by saying that Roosevelt had brought about Pearl Harbor on purpose. And there's something very common to that with the theory about 9/11, which is that in order to get his war in the Middle East, which for some reason he'd wanted, Bush had effectively done the same thing. He had brought about, or actually made happen, the attack on the Twin Towers. And there's almost, I feel like, a kind of perfect symmetry between the defeated anti-war people of 1940 and the defeated anti-war people of 2001. In the case of JFK, there was the suggestion that America was the kind of society that spawned people who would cut off very promising national leaders in their prime. You know, the Lee Harvey Oswalds. One of the things that we've got to remember about both the murder of JFK and 9/11 was the enormous trauma that they caused. I mean, real psychological damage. And in the case of 9/11, that America was so hated abroad that people would want to do this to it. In a way, a kind of less traumatic explanation, in a funny sort of sense, was that there were shadowy forces at work in the government that actually were responsible for both. That explanation was slightly more tolerable than the real explanations were, that the world was an incredibly difficult place, or that there were people in American society who were deeply troubled and who had been and always were likely to cause mayhem if given the chance.
What we do is we ask questions of people who really know the answers, and we come to our own conclusions by surveying all the answers to all the questions that we asked. And I've asked dozens of structural engineers and scientists about what happened on 9/11, and the answer I uniformly get from credible sources is, overall, the story tends to be supported by the evidence.
They did it in order to get their wars, their oil, and in order to impose tyranny on the American people.
Some experts believe there is a strong psychological component to these belief systems.
I talked about conspiracy theories with friends of mine and acquaintances who work in the fields of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. Not least because one of the major explanations always given is that people are paranoid. Two things came out, really. First was the desire to have a story always that is better than reality. We demand the story. It completes something in us. Conspiracy theory is an improvement upon reality. Somebody has designed the whole thing to happen exactly like that. There are no accidents, there are no contingencies. And as one friend of mine put it, the thing about paranoia is that there is something worse than paranoia. Is what he calls the catastrophe of indifference. Conspiracy theories posits a situation which we're never on our own, because there's always some form of intelligence organising the events of the world into some kind of shape or pattern. But suppose there isn't a shape or a pattern. That's the thing which is really intolerable.
This perspective might explain the real results of our experiments. Not our forensic conclusions, but the reaction of those who seem to dispute not only these findings, but the entire idea of testing the strengths or weaknesses of their arguments. But no one, no matter what their beliefs, can deny that a trauma occurred that has not been healed, and in fact may never be healed.